welcome to our next episode of Minerva PLM TV. I'm Jennifer Moore, your host, and I have with me today a very special guest, Bjorn Fijelind from plmPartner. Bjorn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. And Bjorn, of course, I'm quite familiar with your writings on your blog and a lot of the work that you're doing in digital transformation and overall PLM topics. But for those that are not as familiar with you, would you share a little bit about your background and how you found yourself in PLM?
Yeah, actually, my background is not PLM. 20 years ago, I was a computer engineer and programmer, but I started out programming virtual reality, actually, 20 years ago. Imagine that.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And what our founder saw that was that he thought that they could use our virtual reality libraries and merge that together with a PLM platform to create what is now commonly referred to as a digital twin and hand this over to operations. This was back in the offshore oil and gas industry. So we actually developed on a PLM platform a digital twin 20 years ago, but it never really kicked off. And now we're here 20 years later, and everybody's talking about it.
That's totally wild.
Yeah. So my background is started out in oil and gas, and there I got familiar with then PDM, product data management platforms. And after working in that industry for a few years, I actually went to work for a value-added reseller of a PLM system, and worked in many different roles, from programming, obviously, to consulting, project management, and even development manager at one point. And we found ourselves more and more in advising roles. So we worked in different industries, ranging from med tech to oil and gas, naturally, and minerals, auto manufacturing, defense and aerospace, and even consumer product goods. So a very wide PLM background. In the last couple of years, I've been working more with strategic advisory with several different clients. So that's briefly about my background.
That's a pretty extensive history. And of course, like I mentioned, I've been reading your blogs. You've done quite a few posts on digital transformation. What's your take on that buzzword? What does it really mean in a PLM context?
So for me, digital transformation is, everybody wants to take the tagline digital transformation equals PLM, especially if you're in the PLM sphere, from the PLM world.
Yep.
But everybody else does that too, whether you're in design and engineering, or whether you're from logistics or enterprise asset management. So everybody wants to focus around their area and put the tagline digital transformation on it. For me and most of the clients that I advise, what we see is, of course, it cuts across all. There is not one system that conquers them all. There needs to be information flowing between the different platforms, and there needs to be interoperability between different departments in a company, obviously, but also between the software tools, so that you can harvest all the knowledge from engineering, for instance, use that both in manufacturing, but also ultimately out in the field for operations and maintenance, if it's a facility, but even harvesting knowledge from products if you're into new service offerings with the Internet of Things, or with harvesting data from sensors. So for me, digital transformation is a natural evolution, but in order to make that happen, something needs to be done with interoperability. So how information flows, and that it can be translated, at least between the different departments in a company, and also between the software tools. But the software tools are not going to run this. The businesses, in my view, run this.
Yes.
Because they have the needs. But I've seen several clients that have huge PLM projects, very nicely defined engineering-wise globally. And then, for instance, the ERP integration just sends over a flat list of an engineering bill of material. So all of the data from engineering actually gets lost in translation. And a lot of the metadata isn't even there. So, of course, a lot of that information would be very beneficial for manufacturing to know about, even procurement and logistics to know about.
Absolutely.
But it just stays in the PLM platform. And that's, in my view, what it's about, to make the knowledge available across the company, across the different departments and the different groups.
Okay, so not just moving to a digital environment, but really thinking about the interoperability of the different processes and doing a knowledge capture and eliminating those silos. So with that, how do you really start to break down digital transformation into actionable steps or something of that nature for manufacturing companies specifically?
So first of all, it is to define the, of course, the different object structures. So of course, you have your traditional engineering bill of material, your design models and the design assemblies. But then, of course, what data is it on the parts? And is that data translatable? So several of my clients, what they've been looking into is engineering, what they refer to as engineering master data. First of all, define within the company, or even better, if it's possible, use a industry standard to define what is stuff called, what are the parts called. Secondly, what are the attributes, the behaviors that needs to be defined on those parts. And then the tricky part, well, if it's called that in PLM, it should be called the same thing in ERP or any other system as well, right?
Ideally, yes.
But it never is. So either you have a huge program to define it so it's called the same thing across, or one needs some sort of a dictionary in order to translate all of this. And there are several standards that do that. None of them are perfect. It's not just plug and play. But I see a lot of companies really putting effort in trying to standardize the information flow because interoperability is so important to them.
So with this idea of master data and trying to harmonize the information in different systems and between different departments, and this idea of dictionaries and whatnot, can you go a little bit deeper into why data governance and data cleansing is so important for digital transformation?
Yeah, so an example would be, of course, if you're only doing in-house engineering and you're only in a small geographical area and you don't need to share information, then no, master data is not important. But I've never come across that as a case. And especially now, it's become really important now because we're talking more and more about harvesting data from devices and products being used in the field and actually create other services on those products. And once we do that, we need, of course, a feedback loop from the field, but that needs to be interpreted in terms of feedback to engineering as well. Well, what are we going to change? How can it be changed? And then the data must be connected.
Yes.
Because if it's not connected, then there is a problem.
It would be pretty difficult to come up with new solutions or ideas or even doing the predictive maintenance without that type of information that's very clear and concise, no matter who it's touching.
Exactly. And especially for, if you're talking predictive maintenance on products or in facilities, it is extremely important that the data is comparable and interoperable. They don't necessarily need to be called exactly the same thing, even though that would be perfect. But there needs to be a dictionary that can translate between the different disciplines or tools, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And this idea of a dictionary or even a Rosetta Stone really makes a lot of sense to me. You know, building up that product definition in the library. It's of course going to contain standards, you know, maybe from somebody like IHS, or, you know, even some of the CAD tools have like standard parts and things of that nature. But also things that are externally sourced and unique really to each company. So with that, I mean, the improvements for interoperability to me seem pretty clear, but is there anything else that you would like to share in that topic about, you know, how to create a dictionary, or more on the why besides just understanding?
Yeah, sure. Of course, there are several different standards. I could take one example. ISO 5926 is widely used in process industry, originated from oil and gas. I've been a part of implementing that as master data for several companies. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that sounds great. There is a standard. But what we did, we actually had a collaboration partner, and we just imported the class library into one of our in the PLM system. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we got a beautiful class library of about 8,000 classes and 3,000 attributes. Great start, but what do you know? The attributes were not defined for what classes that they were going into. So standardized attributes, standardized classes, so types, if you will. So we needed to actually set up a group, multidiscipline across the company, to define for our purpose what attributes go for what classes from our perspective that we need. Mm-hmm. But the bad thing about that is, of course, then it becomes a proprietary standard in the company based on an international standard.
Right.
And the whole point of that standard is to create not only interoperability between software tools, but also to create interoperability between companies in the supply chain for a capital facilities project. Mm-hmm. So ideally, you could just hand over, if you're an engineering, procurement, construction company responsible for actually designing and building a facility, you would hand over the data to the operator seamlessly. Okay. But that won't happen if the operator has one flavor of the standard and you as a company have a different flavor of the standard. And you still need this mapping in between. Mm-hmm. So, but of course, it's a lot better than starting from scratch. I've seen companies start from scratch and building their own master data as well. But of course, a lot of companies, especially in capital facilities industries, they've recognized this. So they set up a forum called CIFAS, Capital Facilities Information Handover Specification. Now that's a tongue twister. But the whole objective is then to define among the industry, what attributes should these classes have? What is needed from an operations and maintenance perspective from the operators, and really agree on that data contract. Mm-hmm. There has been progress, but of course it's slow. Other standards in other industries like auto manufacturing and to some extent defense industry have the same or different standards, but the same methodology. But still, there is a lot of work that needs to be done from the companies themselves. So my advice to anybody looking into master data, especially engineering master data, is set together a group that is multidiscipline and consists of members from different departments in the company, and then take one bite at a time. It's going to be a continuous improvement, continuous process to define the attributes, the unit of measures needed, the class names, etc. If you don't use a standard. And this takes time. It takes an enormous amount of time. For some companies, they've taken engineering master data one step forward, and not only have the master data as class library and attributes that can be used by parts, by assets, by tags, but they also define standardized data structures.
Mm-hmm.
So look at it as a catalog of, from product engineering, it's like a ready-made engineering bill of material.
Mm-hmm.
So a configurable 180, 150% engineering bill of material. Of course, that's common in product engineering.
Mm-hmm.
But they were then to define not only engineering bill of material, so the product aspect, but also the project-specific aspect, and even the maintenance aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So when they were to pick something from the catalog, they would get auto-generated information structures that would be tied into either a project or a product. And then, of course, they would do some tweaking on it, but they would get a very good template as structured data, not as documents,
right?
But as real structured data structures.
I think that's important too, and you've hit on quite a few points here that are very valuable, but I can't help but wonder, what's the cart and what's the horse? Whenever it comes to looking at, master data and standards and PLM and digital transformation and all of these different things that people could do to improve their business, is there one answer across the board, or does it vary company by company where they should start? And what are your practical tips? Sorry, big question, long one. What are your practical tips for deciding where you should really spend your time and your energy?
Well, those are very, very good questions. I'll try to answer them. But there is no one answer. There is no silver bullet, at least in my experience. Mm-hmm. A lot of the most successful initiatives that I've seen have something in common, and that is it is securely supported by top management.
That makes sense to me.
Of course, a lot of PDM, so product data management initiatives, and also PLM initiatives, that starts from product engineering. Mm-hmm. And then starts to grow, and one tries to break out of engineering and really utilize the full life cycle of product life cycle management. However, a lot of those initiatives get resistance in the organization because that's something for engineering. It's not for the rest of the company. But
even when it really is.
Exactly. But so if you in your company have this initiative even rolled out from engineering, and it's like engineering owns it, there needs to be quite a lot of activities in order to explain, to roll out in the organization, and also to get management on board to see the benefits of this. And at the end of the day, if there's not a good use case for why this is a good idea and will actually and will actually create benefits, tangible benefits to the company, then maybe you don't need to do it. But a lot of companies, they see that, especially now when they need to come up with new service offerings based on how the product is responding in the field. Mm-hmm. So your product as a platform kind of thing, then all of these things really make sense a lot more than, for instance, what it did 20 years ago.
That makes a lot of sense.
You had a few more questions there, so if you care to repeat them, I'll try to answer them.
Oh gosh, how do you decide where to start? I think was one of the other ones.
How to decide where to start? Well, it's different from company to company, actually. I've seen some starting with the data governance to get that in place first. I've seen some companies focus a lot on getting the data structures up to speed first and their release mechanisms and that part. and then moving along to making to doing the master data part. In some companies, it is driven from the field, needs from the service organizations, realizations that, well, what they actually use for information in the field doesn't really match what they thought it were from engineering. Mm-hmm. So disconnect between engineering and what's out there in the field. So if you then want to actually have a feedback loop, I've discussed this with a lot of companies, and everybody seems to agree that, yeah, those feedback loops are really important to get data, information, and knowledge about what's going on in the service organization when they're actually maintaining these products. Mm-hmm. Get that knowledge back to engineering so that you can do engineering and design better for the next version of the product. Mm-hmm. But almost everybody agrees that there is no real feedback loop. That's where we have some huge issues. And of course, if it's not important to management, and if you cannot explain to management that, well, if we actually had a feedback loop and that data was interoperable, we could all actually measure not only on the products that are in the field, but even benchmark that towards our engineering data, because it's interoperable. And that would be of huge value to a lot of companies.
So what I heard was that it depends on where you're at in your journey to begin with and what your challenges and objectives are. Because if you don't have anything, then maybe interoperability isn't the first problem to solve. Maybe it's change management, right?
Yeah.
But if you have, go ahead.
Yeah, because if you're starting from scratch, you don't really have anything to be interoperable with. So if you're starting from scratch, I wouldn't start with master data. I would start with actually defining your product as a data structure, so engineering bill of material, harvest, and consolidate your design data towards that engineering bill of material. Mm-hmm. And then looking at the wider ecosystem of both applications, but also departments. So for ERP integrations, etc. But in some cases where they have some of it in place, but want to do a bigger journey, try to connect both departments, but also systems, then all of a sudden master data goes quite high on the agenda.
That's extremely practical. I like that breakdown a lot, and I have definitely heard stories about companies, that are not starting from scratch. They're very much on the opposite end of the spectrum, where they have multiple solutions in place of all different kinds, whether through acquisition or other strategies to improve their business, where now they're looking at, okay, we have this vast field of information, and now we want to take it to the next level.
Exactly.
So that makes a lot of sense. All right, great. Any final thoughts or words of wisdom?
Well, in my view, what's really important is, of course, yeah, you should have a vision, but everybody's got a vision. But then you need to have a strategy for actually how to get there, and it needs to be stepwise. And after that, well, it needs to be practical, down to earth, and I mean, there's only one way to eat an elephant, and that is one bite at a time.
Yes.
And remember to chew in between.
Very practical. Well,
so these things, they do take time. They take a frustrating amount of time, but remember, it's not only the technology. I mean, there is change management of the organization. There is rollout. There is the people aspect. There are different cultures within a company, and then different cultures from engineering and from logistics and all the different departments. And if it's really going to work, all of these need to talk together and speak the same language. that was actually one of the lessons learned from a major project I was in, and it lasted several years. We had product engineering, we had plant engineering, and they were from 2 different continents actually due to acquisition. And we also had a logistics department in there. And the very interesting part, we flew everybody in, the main stakeholders, every 3 months, and had several workshops. And in the beginning, there was so much resistance. It was almost like a trench war between the different departments. Because all of this upfront frustration, all now face-to-face, you could air it. And we were thinking, well, this can get challenging. But we had a very, very good moderator, and he elegantly steered it in a way so that we were just sort of like maturing together.
That's good.
And after a few of these workshops, 12 months later, then we had 4 of them, the big ones, all of a sudden, you couldn't really tell who was plant engineering, who was product engineering, who came from logistics, who came from sales, because people had started to understand the other's perspective of things and were now uniformly working towards a common goal. And that is extremely important if you want to do a digital transformation, because remember, you're not only transforming your IT landscape, you're actually transforming your company.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And that's a great testament to, strong leadership and people really coming together to achieve that common goal. I love that. All right. Well, this has been really great, Bjorn, and I definitely expect to have you back again because you've got so much knowledge to share. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
And to all of our viewers today, thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this content, please hit the like and subscribe button to be alerted to our future content. And if you have a question that you want answered, as always, drop your comments below or send me an email at jmo@minerva-plm.com. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.